Tobias and Marit Sundquist, at 74 and 73, after 51 years of marriage and 40 cherry harvests on the Sundquist family orchard above Sturgeon Bay, had believed that the boy they had raised since the age of 12 would never be the man who quietly sold his grandparents' farm without asking them. They were wrong. 2 years after Toby's heart procedure, their grandson Brock had stepped in to manage things. He had moved them out of the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road and into a tidy 2-bedroom in a Green Bay assisted living complex he himself had developed. He had taken the keys to the orchard. When Toby and Marit heard from Greta Olsen at the library that the old Sundquist honey house was going up for tax auction the following Tuesday, they counted what they had. 3 folded dollar bills in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator. They drove down anyway. Brock was supposed to be there. Brock had been planning for that auction for 6 months. Brock was meeting an investor in Milwaukee when the gavel came down at $3 to the only bidders in the room, his grandparents, in their wool coats and work boots, with a coffee can of singles between them. What Brock had never understood about his great-great-grandfather, Olaf, was that the old Norwegian had built a vault into the wall behind the honey extracting room that none of his 3 sons had ever been told about. If you've ever been managed by a grandchild who waited until you were tired, if you've ever counted $3 from a coffee can and driven to a courthouse with the only money you still controlled, if you've ever stood at an auction counter in your wool coat and your work boots while a younger man laughed at the idea you might bid, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Toby and Marit Sundquist found behind the honey extracting room of that $3 honey house will make you believe that a Norwegian beekeeper built a vault only the right grandparents are ever meant to open. Welcome to the last chapter. The slow erosion had begun, as these things often do, with kindness. 2 autumns earlier, on a damp October morning, when the sugar maples along Cherryland Road had turned the color of old copper kettles, Toby Sundquist had felt a tightness in his chest while loading the last bushel of Montmorency cherries into the bed of his old blue Ford pickup. He hadn't said anything to Marit. He had finished the load. He had driven the cherries down to the cooperative on the Bay Road. He had only mentioned it 3 days later, in the kitchen, after she set down a bowl of oatmeal and noticed the gray cast under his weathered tan. The cardiologist in Green Bay had scheduled a procedure within the week. A stent. Routine, the doctor had said. Common as a head cold for a man his age. Toby had walked out of the hospital 4 days later with a small white prescription bottle and a printed sheet of restrictions. And Marit had driven the pickup home with both hands on the wheel and her mouth set in the particular line she used for difficult Beethoven sonatas. Brock had arrived the following Saturday with a folder. The folder had been the first sign. Their grandson had been a sweet boy once, the kind who sat on the porch swing reading library books while Toby tended hives along the orchard's eastern slope. The kind who learned to drive on the orchard's gravel lanes and called Marit Gran with a small, soft catch in his voice. They had raised him from 12 after their only son, Brock's father, had died of a heart attack at 36 in a parking lot in Appleton on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, leaving behind a thin, pale boy who needed somewhere to be. Toby and Marit had given him the upstairs bedroom with the dormer window. Marit had taught him to read music. Toby had taught him to inspect a frame for brood. He had grown into a tall, lean young man with sharp gray eyes and an aptitude for numbers, and somewhere in his late 20s, after a real estate license and a series of larger and larger handshakes in Green Bay restaurants, the catch had gone out of his voice. The folder had contained a power of attorney, a health care directive, and a property management agreement. Brock had spread the pages across the kitchen table and explained them slowly, the way a salesman explains a high-end appliance to a customer he does not respect. "Just so the orchard runs while you rest, Grandpa," he had said. "Just so Gran doesn't have to chase down the property tax notices alone. We are family. I'll handle it." Marit had watched her grandson's face the entire time he was speaking. She had said nothing. She had handed Toby the pen. Toby, still tired from the hospital, with the pale gray cast still under his eyes, had signed. Within 4 months, Brock had presented them with a brochure for the Maples at Brookwood, an assisted living complex in Green Bay with a glassed-in atrium and a baby grand piano in the lobby, and a monthly fee that, he assured them, the sale of underutilized property would more than cover. Within 7 months, the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road had a sold sign on the lawn, and Toby and Marit were unpacking 39 boxes into a tidy 2-bedroom apartment with beige carpet and a window that faced a parking lot. Within 14 months, the Sundquist cherry orchard, 40 acres of Montmorency and sweet cherry trees that Olaf had planted between the bee yards in 1912, had been quietly transferred to a Brock-controlled LLC and sold to a Milwaukee development group for what Brock had described, vaguely, as a fair price. Toby and Marit had received a single check for $63,000 deposited into the joint account Brock managed. The remainder, Brock had explained, was being held in trust for their continuing care. Marit had begun keeping a small spiral notepad in the inner pocket of her heather gray wool coat. She had begun, as a music teacher will, marking time. She had also, that spring, begun stopping by the Sturgeon Bay Public Library. On the Tuesday mornings she could persuade Toby to drive her up from Green Bay for a doctor's appointment. Greta Olsen had been the head librarian for 31 years before her retirement, and now she sat at a small reference desk near the local history shelves 3 days a week, signing yellow request slips and humming to herself. Greta knew everything that happened on the peninsula within 48 hours. It was Greta who slid a folded photocopy of a tax auction notice across the polished oak desk on a damp Tuesday in September. "Marit," Greta had said quietly, "look what's on Tuesday's docket." The notice listed, in the dry block lettering of the Door County Clerk's office, 1 parcel, the old Sundquist honey house, a single-story timber frame building on what the modern county map listed as a half-acre patch of overgrown ground at the eastern edge of the orchard. Tax delinquent. Minimum opening bid, $3. Marit had folded the notice into her notepad. She had said nothing to Brock. That night, in the kitchenette of the Brookwood apartment, she had taken down the old red coffee can from the top of the refrigerator and counted what was inside. 3 folded singles, 2 quarters, a handful of pennies. She had set the $3 on the table in front of Toby and waited. He had looked at the money for a long time. Then he had said, in the slow, careful voice he used when he had already made up his mind, "We'll take the truck." The Door County Courthouse on the Tuesday morning of the auction was almost empty. A heating vent rattled. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s named Doreen, had looked over her glasses at the elderly couple in the wool coats and the sturdy work boots, and had asked gently if they were quite sure. Toby had laid the 3 folded singles on the counter. "We're sure," he had said. Marit had set her hand on the small of his back, the way she had done at every important threshold of 51 years. The gavel had come down at 3 minutes past 10. There had been no other bidders. The honey house was theirs. They drove home along the Bay Road with the windows cracked and the smell of late cherries and lake fog filling the cab, and neither of them spoke for the first 8 miles. Marit watched a pair of sandhill cranes pacing through a stubble field. Toby watched the road. Somewhere south of Carlsville, Marit said. Olaf would have laughed. Toby said. Olaf would have nodded. They both, after a moment, smiled. Brock's silver Audi pulled into the Brookwood parking lot 15 minutes after they got back. He was shouting before he reached the door of the apartment. He came in without knocking, with his Patagonia vest still zipped and his sharp gray eyes blazing in the way Marit had learned over the past 2 years to recognize as the particular fury of a salesman who had been outsold. "What did you do?" he said. "What did you do?" Toby was hanging his olive cap on the peg by the door. He turned slowly. "We bought the honey house," he said. "We won't be needing your help with it." He set the small piece of paper, the auction receipt, on the kitchen counter, $3 in fees, his name and Marit's typed in clean block letters, and walked past his grandson into the bedroom, and closed the door quietly behind him. For 2 days, Brock did not speak to them. On the 3rd day, Marit went up to Sturgeon Bay alone with Toby's pickup, ostensibly for a hair appointment, and stopped at Wadsworth's Diner on 3rd Avenue for the soup of the day. She slid into a booth at the back near the window and unfolded her notepad on the laminated tabletop. 2 booths up, with his back to her, sat her grandson. Beside him sat 2 men in expensive zip-up fleeces with the logos of Milwaukee development firms stitched on the chests, and across from him sat a 3rd man in a navy blazer. They had not seen her come in. The waitress, an old friend of Greta's, set Marit's coffee down without a word and returned to the counter. "You should have seen them," Brock was saying, his voice loud with the looseness of a second beer at lunch. "Walked in there in their wool coats like it was 1952. $3. 3 actual dollars in a coffee can. The senile old couple outbid me on a building that's supposed to be condemned." He laughed. The other men laughed. "Honestly, it's almost cute. They think they own a honey house. They don't even understand the survey on that parcel. Half acre of nothing. I'll have them out of there by Christmas." He took a long pull of his beer. Senile old couple. Marit did not move. She wrote 3 words in her notepad, in the small, precise hand she had used for 40 years to write the names of children on lesson cards. Then she folded the notepad, paid for her coffee, left a $2 tip, and walked out past her grandson's booth without turning her head. Brock did not see her. He was already telling the men about the resort. She drove home along the lake. She did not cry. She sang very softly, an old hymn her own grandmother had sung in the kitchen on butter-churning afternoons in the 1950s, a Norwegian hymn whose words she had mostly forgotten, but whose melody had outlasted everything. By the time she pulled into the Brookwood lot, the sun was sliding low and gold across the bay, and she had decided what they would do. That evening, after a quiet supper of bean soup and brown bread, Toby and Marit drove out to the honey house. They left the truck at the end of the gravel lane and walked the last quarter-mile through the abandoned cherry rows in the long autumn light. The sugar maples on the windbreak burned the color of struck matches. A young white-tailed doe stepped out of the birch line at the eastern edge of the orchard, paused and looked at them, and walked, unhurried, across the gold weeds toward the bay. They did not move until she had crossed. Then they sat on the low stone wall foundation that marked the south face of the honey house and watched the last of the light go out of the lake. Toby spoke first. "My grandfather built this in 1908, he said. "Olaf laid every one of these stones with a borrowed mason's hammer. In a winter so cold the mortar had to be warmed on a coal stove. He brought his bees over from Telemark in a cedar crate the year before. He raised 3 sons in the cabin that used to stand where the windbreak is now. My father took it over in 1939. Our boy was supposed to take it from me." His voice did not catch. It only went very slow. Brock was supposed to take it from him. Marit reached for his hand. Their hands had touched at this exact angle, on this exact stone wall, every Sunday evening for the first decade of their marriage. The wall remembered. "He still might," she said. "We don't know what's inside yet." "No," Toby said. "We don't." They sat until the bay went black. Then Marit took her flip phone from the pocket of her wool coat, scrolled with one knuckle to the right number, and pressed call. "Greta," she said, "we bought the honey house." There was a pause on the line. And then Greta Olsen said, in her careful library voice, "I'll bring the bolt cutters." The next morning, just after 7, with the bay still under a cap of low silver fog, Greta Olsen pulled her dark green Subaru up the gravel lane behind Toby's old Ford. She climbed out in a quilted barn coat and a knit cap, with a pair of long-handled bolt cutters slung over one shoulder and a thermos of coffee in her free hand. She kissed Marit on the cheek and shook Toby's hand and said, "Show me the lock." The honey house stood as it had stood for 117 autumns. Cedar shingles weathered to the gray of driftwood, the green shingled roof sagging on its north side where a sugar maple had fallen against it in a windstorm 5 winters earlier. The tall stone chimney leaning slightly toward the lake. The east-facing windows boarded over with weathered planks, and at the center of the south face, the heavy oak door with iron strap hinges, and on the door, the brass-bound iron padlock that Olaf Sundquist had set in place sometime in the early 1940s, according to family memory, and that no Sundquist had cut since. Greta took the bolt cutters off her shoulder, settled her boots in the wet grass, and squared the jaws on the shackle. The first cut went halfway through the iron. The second cut took it clean. The padlock fell into Toby's outstretched palm with a heavy final little weight, and Toby looked at it for a long moment in the silver light, the brass plate green with verdigris, the iron warmed already by the friction of the cut. And then he closed his fist around it and put it in the pocket of his navy waxed cotton field jacket. "Open the door, Tobias," Marit said softly. He set his shoulder to the oak and pushed. The door resisted, the way old oak will resist after 80 years of swelling and shrinking. And then it gave, with a long, low groan and a small puff of dust that smelled of beeswax and pine resin and cold stone. The morning light slid in across the plank floor in 3 pale bars from the cracks between the boarded windows, and the inside of the Sundquist honey house, untouched by any human hand for more than half a century, came slowly into view. The long wooden honey extracting tables ran the length of the room, 2 of them side by side, their tops dark with the seasoned amber of 50 seasons of honey. A tall, hand-cranked centrifuge, half collapsed on its iron frame, sagged in the far corner under a drift of dust. Wooden frames, empty of comb but stacked with the patient geometry of a master beekeeper, filled racks along the north wall. Above the extracting tables, pinned to a board with rusted thumbtacks, a yellowed schematic showed a centrifugal extractor in patient pencil cross-section, dated in the upper right corner in a careful Norwegian immigrant hand, 1934. The tall stone chimney rose in the back wall and disappeared through a square hole in the green shingled roof, and below the chimney, on the back wall, where the boards had been laid in a slightly different pattern than the rest of the boarding, Toby stopped. He ran his thumb along the seam. He stepped back. He stepped forward again. "Marit," he said, "bring me the lamp." She brought him the small battery lamp from her satchel, and he set it on the extracting table and angled the beam at the wall. The pattern was clear in the sidelight. 8 planks, in a frame 2 feet wide and 4 feet high, set into the plank wall with a finish nail at each corner, and behind them the unmistakable line of something that was not wall. "It's a panel," Greta said quietly. "It is," Toby said. He worked the planks loose with the small flat pry bar he had carried in the bed of the pickup for 40 years. The nails came out one by one with a soft complaining sound, and the panel came away, and behind the panel, set into a wall of fitted Door County limestone that no one outside this room had seen in 80 years, stood a heavy iron-banded vault door, 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with a brass knob the size of a small apple, and wired to the knob with a single twist of copper wire was a brass tag the size of a playing card. And on the brass tag, in the careful Norwegian immigrant English of Olaf Sundquist, was etched in patient pin-pricked letters, "For the Sundquist who keeps the orchard." Toby read it twice. Marit read it once. Greta did not say anything at all. The morning fog outside thinned along the orchard line, and somewhere up by the Bay Road, a flock of geese went over, and Toby Sundquist set the heel of his hand against the cold iron knob and felt, through the metal, the faint long memory of his grandfather's hand. "There's a key," Marit said quietly, watching the brass tag swing. "There has to be a key." "There has to," Toby agreed. He turned slowly, and his sharp blue eyes traveled the room with the patient attention of a man who has spent 40 harvests reading the bones of a barn. Marit watched him. She had, over 51 years, learned to recognize the precise stillness that meant her husband was assembling a structure in his head. She set her own brown leather satchel on the extracting table, drew out the spiral notepad and a sharpened pencil, and began, in the small, precise hand she had used to write the names of children on lesson cards for 39 years, to catalog the room. "Centrifuge, hand crank, iron frame, north corner," she wrote. "Wooden frames, empty, 96 on rack." She paused, counted again, 98. She wrote 98. She wrote, "Patent diagram, dated 1934, pinned above east table." She wrote, "Stone chimney in back wall, leaning 2 degrees south by my eye." She wrote, "Floorboards, tongue and groove, white pine original, loose plank under west window." Toby wasn't idle. He moved along the wall the way he had moved along the eastern slope of the orchard for 40 Aprils, reading the trees for winter damage, the way his father had taught him and his grandfather had taught his father. He pressed each plank of the south wall with the heel of his hand. He sounded the floor with his boot. He climbed onto the extracting table and ran his palm along the underside of the green shingled roof boards. He came down. He stood in front of the iron-banded vault door and did not touch it. He turned around and looked at the long wooden extracting tables. "Marit," he said, "bring the lamp around." On the underside of the second extracting table, in the deep amber-stained wood, a small leather-bound logbook had been set into a shallow recess that a casual hand would never have found. Toby drew it out. The cover was the soft, buttery brown of leather kept oiled for decades. The spine read, in Olaf's hand, in faded gold ink, "Apiary Records, Sundquist, 1908. Toby opened it. The first page bore the date June 4th, 1908, and a single line. "First swarm housed. 6 frames. Queen marked white." Below that, on the same line, Olaf had written, in Norwegian, "Velsignet være begardain. Blessed be the bee yards." Toby turned the pages slowly. Yields, hive counts, genetics notes, shipping ledgers, weather, frost dates, bloom dates. The handwriting marched across the pages in a careful, slow line for 49 years. The last entry was dated April 2nd, 1957, and read, in a hand that had grown slightly trembling, "2 weak hives this spring. The good Lord and the cherry bloom will decide." He had died that May peacefully, of natural causes, at 77 in the upstairs bedroom of the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road, with his wife beside him and the smell of the first apple blossom drifting through the open window. Toby remembered very faintly being 8 years old and standing at the foot of the bed. He turned the back cover of the logbook over in his hands. Inside the cover, taped to the leather with a yellowed strip of cloth tape, sat a small iron key. "Marit," he said. She came around the table. She saw the key. She did not say anything. She set her hand on his shoulder. By the middle of the afternoon, Greta had driven into Sturgeon Bay and back twice, the second time with 3 reference books from the local history shelf and a manila folder of photocopied beekeeping circulars from the 1930s. By 4, she had also called her nephew, who was Eric Halverson's son-in-law, and by 5:15, Eric Halverson himself had pulled up the gravel lane in a battered tan Bronco. Eric was 67, with a neatly trimmed white beard and the slightly bowed back of a man who had spent 40 winters bent over hive boxes for the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. He had known Toby's father, Sven, professionally in the late 1970s on a routine apiary inspection, out of which had grown a friendship of mutual respect that had lasted until Sven's death. Eric climbed out of the Bronco, lifted his weather-beaten ranger cap to Marit, and said, "Greta tells me you have something I should see." He stood in front of the patent diagram for a long time. He whistled, low, the way men whistle, who have spent their professional lives looking at the second rate. "Toby," he said quietly, "your grandfather drew a centrifugal extractor here that nobody in the trade saw a working version of until 1951. He never patented it. He never sold it. He drew it in 1934, and he hung it on his wall. That diagram alone is worth a museum exhibit." He turned. "What's behind the panel?" Toby showed him. Eric looked at the iron-banded vault door. He looked at the brass tag. He read the inscription. He took off his ranger cap and held it in both hands. "Tobias," he said, "I've been on this peninsula my whole life. I've inspected every commercial apiary between Algoma and Gills Rock. I have never, in 40 years, heard of a vault inside a Door County honey house. Whatever your grandfather put behind that door, he meant it for someone. He meant it for the one who would not sell," Marit said quietly, reading from her notepad. Eric looked at her. "Does the auction receipt have your name on it?" "It has both our names on it," Toby said. "Then I'd say," Eric said slowly, "that the someone is the two of you. They did not open the vault that day." Greta insisted they wait. "Naya should be here," she said. "If there is anything in there of historical or commercial value, you want a clean witness chain." She had already, while driving back from Sturgeon Bay, called Eric, and Eric had already, on the drive over, called Naya Persad, the regional artisanal honey buyer for a Madison cooperative who had spent 6 summers at Eric's elbow, learning to grade Door County wildflower honey by nose. And Naya had said she could be in the gravel lane by 10 the following morning. So they locked the heavy oak door with a new brass padlock Greta had bought at the Sturgeon Bay hardware store on her second trip in, and they drove home along the Bay Road in the long blue dusk, and Toby slept that night, for the first time in 2 years, without waking at 3 in the morning. Naya Persad was 35, slim, with her dark hair pulled back into a low knot, a canvas field bag on her shoulder, and a small calibrated camera around her neck. She had grown up on a small mango orchard outside Trinidad, gone to graduate school in Madison, and fallen in love, somewhere in her late 20s, with the particular floral signature of a Door County wildflower comb. She climbed out of her small dark blue hatchback at 5 minutes after 10, took one look at the honey house in the autumn light, set down her bag, and said, "Oh my, my." Toby led her inside. She walked the length of the building in absolute silence. She knelt in front of the centrifuge. She stood on a chair to study the patent diagram. She opened Olaf's leather-bound logbook on the extracting table and turned the pages with the soft, careful fingertips of a museum conservator. And on page 14, she stopped, set her hand flat against the page, and said, "Mr. Sundquist, your grandfather was crossing his queens for a Door County wildflower expression that the modern industry thought had gone extinct in the 1960s. He was, Toby said. He was, Naya said. And if these queen lines are still in the genetics of any feral colony on this parcel, you and Mrs. Sundquist are sitting on something that the Madison Cooperative will license at a price that will surprise you. They did not open the vault yet." Naya wanted to set up the camera. Eric wanted to walk the parcel first and look for feral colonies. Greta wanted to make sandwiches. Marit wanted, very quietly, for Toby to sit down for 10 minutes in the iron-framed chair Greta had hauled out of the Subaru because his face had gone slightly gray again, and she did not, after 2 years and 1 stent, like that color of gray on her husband's face. Toby sat. He drank a cup of Greta's coffee. He took the small iron key out of the inner pocket of his field jacket and turned it in his fingers, and the iron warmed in his palm. And somewhere, far back along the orchard line, a single late honeybee, released from a feral hollow in a sugar maple, hummed past the open door of the honey house in the autumn light and was gone. It was at exactly that moment, in the hush of the room, that the rumble of a powerful engine on loose gravel rolled up the lane, and Brock's silver Audi pulled to a hard stop in the gravel pad outside the open oak door. Greta moved first. She was 70 years old, but she had spent 31 years managing the front desk of the Sturgeon Bay Public Library on Saturday afternoons, and she knew how to clear a room and how to lock a door. She was at the oak door before Brock had stepped out of his Audi, and she swung it shut and dropped the new brass padlock through the inside hasp Toby had bolted on that very morning. The sound of the bolt sliding home was small and absolute. Outside, the Audi door slammed. Boots crossed the gravel. A fist hit the oak. "Open this door." Brock's voice, tight, loud. "Grandpa, Gran, open this door, right now." Toby sat in the iron-framed chair. He did not stand up. Marit reached for his hand, the way she had reached for it on the stone wall foundation 2 evenings before. The way she had reached for it on the night the doctor had said the word stent. The way she had reached for it on the cold March morning 43 years ago, when their son had been pronounced in a parking lot in Appleton, and they had stood under the fluorescent lights of an emergency room and tried to remember how to breathe. She set her hand on the back of his and did not speak. The fist hit the oak again. "I know you're in there. I saw the Bronco." A pause. "Grandpa, this is a hazardous materials site. There's lead paint and bee mites and rotted timber, and you are trespassing on a property that you have no business being inside of. I am telling you that as your representative." The voice slid up half a step. "Open the door before I call the sheriff." "He cannot call the sheriff," Eric said quietly, from the back of the room. "You bought it at public auction. The deed will be recorded by Friday." "He can call," Greta said. "He just won't get what he wants. Open the door, Grandpa." A small high crack in Brock's voice now, the crack of a man who had not, in 8 years of selling lakeside parcels and resort fractionals to retirees from Chicago, been told no by his grandfather. "Open the door. I am trying to protect you." Toby stood, slowly. He walked across the plank floor to the iron-banded vault door. He set his palm flat against the cold iron. He did not turn the key. He stood there listening, while his grandson on the other side of the oak threatened to call his lawyer and the Wisconsin Department of Health and the county building inspector and the Door County Sheriff. The voice on the other side of the oak slid through every register of a man losing leverage. It became quiet. It became loud again. It became wheedling. It became cold. At the end, after perhaps 14 minutes, in the smallest, meanest voice Marit had ever heard her grandson use, it said, "You senile old man, you senile old man, you don't even know what you're sitting on." Toby took the small iron key out of his palm. He did not yet set it in the brass knob. He turned and looked at Marit. Marit looked back at him. 51 years of marriage passed between them in the silence of a single glance. Outside, the silver Audi door slammed. The engine started. The wheels spun once on the gravel and caught, and the rumble receded down the lane toward the Bay Road and was gone. "He's calling the lawyer," Eric said quietly. "Let him," Marit said. Toby turned back to the vault. He set the small iron key in the brass knob. He turned it. The mechanism inside the iron-banded door, oiled by Olaf Sundquist in the spring of 1956 and not turned since, gave a single smooth low click, and the door, moving on the patient hinges of a master craftsman, swung open into the cedar-lined room behind the wall. The smell came out first: cedar oil, beeswax, old cotton, cold stone, the clean, dry breath of a room that had been sealed for 69 years. Naya had her camera up. Greta held the lamp. Eric stood at Toby's shoulder. Marit stood at his other shoulder. They stepped inside. 3 walls of cedar shelving rose floor to ceiling. The shelves were stacked in the patient-ordered method of a Norwegian immigrant beekeeper who had taught himself bookkeeping by candlelight in 1911, with leather-bound ledgers, oilcloth-wrapped folios, and small numbered tin boxes. On the left wall, 50 years of master beekeeping records, year by year, cross-referenced to the small leather-bound logbook Toby had found under the extracting table. On the back wall, a folded Norwegian flag, the colors faded but intact, the cotton clean. Beside the flag, on a low cedar shelf, a small cast-iron mortar and pestle, stained dark inside with the residue of beeswax and propolis, the kind of mortar a self-taught Norwegian apothecary might have used for cough lozenges in 1912. On the right wall, tin boxes, numbered 1 through 49, each labeled in Olaf's careful hand, with a year and a hive count. Naya pressed her palm against the cedar shelving and closed her eyes. "Mr. Sundquist," she said, "this is a working archive. This is the most complete small apiary archive I have ever, in my professional life, stood inside." Toby was not yet looking at the shelves. He was looking in the careful, patient way of a man who had been taught by his grandfather to read a barn at the topmost ledger on the left wall. There was something taped to the back cover. He drew the ledger down. He turned it over. Taped to the back, with a yellowed strip of cloth tape identical to the strip in the logbook, was a second small iron key, slightly smaller than the first, and below it, in Olaf's hand, on a square of yellowed paper, a single letter. "F floor," Marit said softly. Toby nodded. They found the safe in the third cedar plank from the back wall, set into the floor under a square of cedar that lifted out cleanly when Toby pried it with the flat bar. The safe was small, no larger than a bread tin, iron-banded like the vault door, set into a bed of hand-poured concrete. Toby knelt. The stent in his chest hummed, very faintly, the way it did when he climbed the orchard's eastern slope in April. Marit knelt beside him. He set the small iron key in the lock. He turned it. The lid came up. Inside the safe lay a small oilcloth bundle, and beneath it, a single folded document on heavy linen paper, sealed with wax that had cracked but not broken in 69 years. Toby drew the document out first, with both hands. the way his father had taught him to lift a frame of brood. It was the original 1908 deed of the Sundquist honey house parcel, signed and sealed, recorded with the Door County clerk on the 7th day of May, 1908, witnessed by two men whose names Toby recognized as the great-grandfathers of two families still farming on the Bay Road. The deed described, in the long, careful prose of an early 20th century surveyor, a parcel of 60 acres of Door County waterfront and orchard, bounded on the north by the Bay Road, on the east by the Cedar Swale, on the south by the Old Bluff Line, and on the west by the half-section corner stone set by the original federal survey of 1835. 60 acres. Not the half-acre listed in the modern county records. 60. Eric took the deed from Toby with the careful hands of a man who had read 1,000 deeds. He turned it under the lamp. He read it twice. He took a long, slow breath. "Toby," he said, "there was a survey error in 1987. I remember it. Half the peninsula remembers it. The county redrew the parcel lines along the Bay Road, and they reduced this parcel by 59.5 acres on paper. It was supposed to be corrected. It was never corrected. The original 1908 deed is the controlling instrument until a court properly amends it, and it was never properly amended." He looked up. His eyes were very bright. "Toby, the orchard your grandson sold 18 months ago, those 40 acres, those are inside this deed." Naya had her hand pressed flat against her own breastbone. "All of it? All of it," Eric said, "and the eastern bluff, and the bay frontage, and the cedar swale." He set the deed on the cedar shelf with both hands as gently as a man setting down a sleeping child. 60 acres, Toby, recorded in 1885 for the first homestead, redeeded in 1908 when your grandfather built the honey house, and never legally reduced. The full scope of it came together in the cedar-lined room slowly, the way the bay fog comes off the water in October. Brock had sold 40 acres of cherry orchard 18 months earlier to a Milwaukee development group for what he had described to Toby and Marit as a fair price. That development group was the nominal owner of record on the modern county map. They had, Eric said quietly, never actually held title, because the 1908 deed had never been amended. Brock had then optioned the honey house parcel and 2 adjacent half-acre strips back from the development group at his own discount and folded them into a 7 LLC structure that he had pitched to a private investor pool in Milwaukee under the project name Cherryland Heritage Resort, a luxury cherry blossom development with a 40-room boutique hotel, a tasting barn, 12 glamping yurts, and a marina. The committed investor funding stood. Eric's contact at the Wisconsin DOA had told him on the phone 2 days earlier, at $5.2 million. The resort could not be built without the 60 acres. The 60 acres were now legally tied to the honey house deed. The honey house deed, as of 3 minutes past 10 on the previous Tuesday morning, was in the joint name of Tobias and Marit Sundquist of Door County, Wisconsin. Naya picked up the oilcloth bundle. It was sealed with the same wax. She handed it to Toby. Toby unwrapped it on the cedar shelf. Inside, folded once, was a 1956 Wisconsin Apiary Inspection Certificate, signed by an inspector named O.R. Lindquist, documenting that the Sundquist honey house at the eastern edge of the orchard produced a unique strain of Door County wildflower honey, notable for an unusually high basewood and aster signature, recommended for state fair exhibition. Naya took the certificate in both hands. "Mr. Sundquist," she said very quietly, "I sell honey of this profile in Madison for $48 a pound, and I can't get enough of it." If your feral colonies still carry your grandfather's queen line, this archive becomes a 5-year licensing contract on signature. Beneath the certificate, folded once more, was a sealed envelope, addressed in Olaf's handwriting on the outside in the patient pin-pricked letters of the brass tag, "For the Sundquist who keeps the orchard." Toby took the envelope. His hands were steady. They had loaded 40 harvests of cherries with these hands, and they had set 100,000 frames of brood, and they had held Marit on the night their son had not come home, and they did not, even now, shake. He broke the wax with his thumbnail. He drew out the single page inside. He read it once, silently. Then he read it aloud, in the slow, careful voice of a man who has been waiting, without knowing it, for 69 years, to read a letter from his grandfather. "I built this house in 1908, Toby read, "and I have watched every Sundquist born under this roof. The grandson who reads this has either kept the bees or sold the orchard. If it is the second one, I am sorry. The vault is for the one who would not sell. Walk out of here with your suitcase, my children, and remind the orchard who its people are." He paused. He drew a small breath. Olaf Sundquist, 1956. Marit wept. She did not weep loudly. She wept the way she had wept on the morning after their son's funeral, with both hands in her lap and the tears running down her face in a quiet, steady line that did not change the set of her mouth. Greta took off her glasses and wiped them on the front of her quilted barn coat and put them back on. Eric whistled low. Naya, who had only met them 11 hours earlier, stepped back out of the cedar-lined room with her camera held against her chest because she felt suddenly like a stranger at a private grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Sundquist," she said from the doorway when she could speak. "By tomorrow afternoon, you'll own the most important honey house on the Door County Peninsula and the cherry orchard your grandson just sold to a man who doesn't actually own the rights to the land." Toby refolded the page. He returned it to the oilcloth. He looked at Marit. "We'll go to the registry on Monday," he said. "We'll go to the registry on Monday," Marit agreed. Eric called his former colleague at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture that evening, from Greta's kitchen in Sturgeon Bay, with his ranger cap on the table and a glass of buttermilk at his elbow. And the colleague listened for 14 minutes and then said, "Eric, bring the deed in on Monday morning. I'll put you in front of the right deputy registrar before lunch." Naya filed an authenticity affidavit on the 1908 deed that night from the front seat of her hatchback parked in Greta's driveway, with the deed photographed front and back and the wax seal close shot under daylight LEDs. Greta drove Toby and Marit to the Door County Registry of Deeds in Sturgeon Bay at 9:15 on the Monday morning. The deputy registrar, a quiet woman named Helen who had, as it happened, been a flute student of Marit's in 1983, took the deed in both hands, read it twice, made 3 phone calls, walked the file across the hall to the county surveyor, and walked back 40 minutes later with a stamped record of correction. Within 4 business days, the 60-acre parcel was formally recorded under Tobias and Marit Sundquist's joint name. On the Friday afternoon of that same week, the Door County Planning Commission, in a regularly scheduled session, voted unanimously to revoke the conditional development permits for the Cherryland Heritage Resort. The revocation was procedural. The project's controlling parcel was no longer, on the corrected record, owned by any entity in the 7 LLC structure that had filed the application. The investor pool in Milwaukee, on the advice of 2 separate law firms, withdrew its committed funding within 9 days. Brock Sundquist was given 60 days to refund $5.2 million. He had not, at the time of the Planning Commission vote, the liquid capital to refund it. The Milwaukee Development Group that had nominally purchased the orchard from Brock 18 months earlier filed a breach of warranty suit in the second week. Their lead counsel, a woman in her 40s out of a Wauwatosa firm, was direct with Brock in the deposition. Brock had not, at the time of that earlier sale, held the title he had warranted. The suit sought rescission of the original $63,000 Brock had passed through to his grandparents and an additional $1.1 million in carrying costs and lost development damages. Brock's own attorney, on the second day of the deposition, advised him to settle. Brock's wife, Camille, whom Toby and Marit had met perhaps 11 times in 5 years, filed for legal separation in the third week. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. The papers also cited, in a single careful clause, the financial misrepresentations that her husband had made in the structuring of the 7 LLCs in which she had been listed as a managing member. She moved out of the lake house on Lake Michigan with her 2 suitcases and her dog and went to stay with her sister in Eau Claire. By the end of the second month, Brock had listed the lake house on Lake Michigan with a Sturgeon Bay broker and accepted an offer 11 days after listing for $940,000 against an asking price of $1.3. The proceeds went, in their entirety, to the investor refund. He listed the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road 2 weeks after that, at the broker's strong recommendation, because the breach of warranty settlement still required liquidation. Helen, the deputy registrar, called Marit on a Tuesday evening at the Brookwood apartment and said, in a careful private voice, that the farmhouse had just come on the market and that the broker, who was Helen's cousin's husband, would entertain an offer at fair market value from any qualified buyer who walked in the door. Toby and Marit walked in the door the next morning. The licensing contract Naya had brought up from Madison 3 weeks earlier had cleared its first advance on signature, and the advance, plus what Naya had described as a modest historical archive consulting fee, plus the small but immediate cash flow from the first dozen feral colonies Eric had successfully relocated into restored hive boxes along the orchard's eastern slope, was enough, with a small first-time back into property ownership loan from the Sturgeon Bay Community Bank, to make the offer at fair market value that Brock's creditors required. The closing was on a Thursday in late November, with a thin fall of first snow on the cherry rose and the bay under a low pewter sky, and Toby and Marit Sundquist, after 26 months of beige carpet and a window that faced a parking lot, came home to the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road with 2 suitcases, 1 cardboard box of music books, and a small red coffee can on top of the refrigerator that had 3 folded singles, 2 quarters, and a handful of pennies inside it. Brock tried to call them in the third week of the second month, twice on a Saturday afternoon. They did not answer the phone. He sent, the following Monday, a letter on the letterhead of his attorney, asking for a meeting to discuss family reconciliation and the equitable handling of the estate. Toby read the letter at the kitchen table in the white clapboard farmhouse in the chair his father had built. He folded it once. He set it in the wood stove. He did not light the stove that night because the day had been mild, but he left the letter inside the cold firebox, the way a man might leave a small piece of unfinished business for a colder evening. The Door County men who had nodded at Brock at the Sturgeon Bay Marina. The men in the zip-up fleeces with the development firm logos stitched on the chests. The men who had laughed at Wadsworth's diner, 2 booths up from Marit at the soup of the day, now stopped Toby at the post office and Marit at the coffee shop on 3rd Avenue. They tipped their caps. They asked after Toby's heart. They congratulated Marit on the small front-page article the Door County Advocate had run in the second week, a careful piece by a young reporter named Hannah Ostrowski under the headline, "Eldest Sundquist Heirs Recover Family Apiary," with a black-and-white photograph of Toby and Marit standing in the gravel pad outside the heavy oak door, his hand at her elbow, her eyes very steady. Toby went, on a cold, bright morning in early December, alone, at sunrise, to the small Lutheran cemetery on the bluff above the bay, where 4 generations of Sundquists lay under low gray fieldstones. He carried a small clay vial, sealed with a cork. The vial held the first 3 ounces of honey extracted from the restored Sundquist apiary, drawn that week by Naya from a single frame of sealed comb out of Hive 3 on the eastern slope. He stopped at his grandfather's headstone. He read, as he had read on 140 Sundays of his childhood, the patient inscription, Olaf Sundquist, 1879 to 1957. He kept the bees. Toby uncorked the vial. He poured the honey, slowly, in a thin gold line, along the base of the headstone, onto the cold limestone and the early frost. He did not speak. He stood there, with his olive cap in his hands and his white beard trimmed short against the wind, until the line of honey had thickened in the cold, and the first low light of the December sun had come up over the bay and turned the gold line briefly to fire. Then he set the cork back in the vial, set the empty vial in the inner pocket of his navy waxed cotton field jacket, walked back down the bluff path, and drove home. Naya signed Toby and Marit to a 5-year licensing contract for the Sundquist wildflower honey at $48 a pound, with an annual minimum and a co-branded label that featured, in the center of a cream oval, a single line drawn of a heavy oak door with iron strap hinges. The honey house reopened 14 months after the auction as the Olaf Sundquist Door County Heritage Apiary. The cedar-lined inner room became a small public museum on Norwegian immigrant beekeeping in Wisconsin, with the 1934 patent diagram framed on the back wall under museum-grade glass, the small cast-iron mortar in a low cedar case, the folded Norwegian flag in a tall cedar case beside it, and Olaf's leather-bound logbook open under a glass cover on the original honey-extracting table. Greta Olsen ran the welcome desk on Saturdays, in a quilted barn coat and a pair of new reading glasses, with a thermos of coffee at her elbow, and she did not, in the first 6 months of operation, refuse a single school field trip. The cherry orchard along the eastern slope was restored, slowly, the way an old orchard wants to be restored, with patient pruning and replanting in the gaps and the careful reseeding of the original windbreak. The Olaf Sundquist Apiary Apprenticeship was established in the spring of the second year. It was a paid 2-year program, funded out of the licensing advance and a small grant Naya had helped secure from a Door County Agricultural Foundation, and it trained young people of the peninsula in beekeeping, hive genetics, and small batch honey production. 5 apprentices were accepted in the first year. The first to apply was a young Oneida woman named Dawn Cornelius, 23 years old, whose grandmother had worked the Sundquist orchard in the long summers of the 1960s on the cherry harvest crew, and who had grown up on her grandmother's stories about the old honey house at the eastern edge of the orchard. Marit interviewed Dawn at the kitchen table of the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road, with a plate of butter cookies between them, and offered her the apprenticeship before the second cup of coffee was empty. The other 4 apprentices were a young man from a fishing family out of Bailey's Harbor, 2 siblings whose parents farmed cabbage on the North Peninsula, and a returning veteran from Sturgeon Bay who had spent 2 tours in the Army and was, the screening interview showed, exceptionally patient with bees. Eric Halverson consulted on hive health twice a month, retired or not, and accepted his fee in jars of the Newport wildflower honey rather than cash. Naya brought restaurateurs up from Chicago in small, careful tasting groups twice a season, and the Sundquist wildflower honey appeared by the end of the second year on the menus of 7 restaurants between Madison and Milwaukee under the line Door County, Single Apiary, Basewood, and Astor. Greta wrote the museum's first walking tour pamphlet in a single weekend at her kitchen table and produced, on a borrowed risograph at the Sturgeon Bay Library, the first run of 300 copies, every one of which was taken by a visitor in the first 8 Saturdays. Toby and Marit's marriage, 51 years old at the auction and now 53 at the second restoration, had been re-anchored by the shared discovery in the cedar-lined room. They walked the orchard at dawn, hand in hand, every Sunday. Toby's heart, monitored quarterly by the same cardiologist in Green Bay, held steady, and the doctor remarked, at a routine checkup in the second autumn, that he had not, in his clinical experience, seen a patient at 76 recover the kind of color in the face that Mr. Sundquist seemed to have recovered. Marit took up her music again on the upright piano in the front parlor of the farmhouse, the same upright Brock had once practiced his scales on at 12, and she gave free Saturday lessons to the apprentice's younger siblings in the late afternoon. The kitchen at Cherryland Road smelled by the second harvest, the way it had smelled in the 1980s, of bread and bean soup and the faint warm note of beeswax candles cooling in the back pantry. On the first Sunday of October in the second year, with the sugar maples burning on the windbreak and the bay under a low silver fog, Toby and Marit walked the orchard at dawn together, as they had walked it every Sunday since the closing. They stopped, as they always stopped, at the low stone wall foundation on the south face of the honey house. Toby set his hand on the cold limestone. Marit set her hand on his. The young white-tailed doe who had crossed the orchard on the evening of the auction, or perhaps her daughter, stepped out of the birch line at the eastern edge and paused and looked at them and walked, unhurried, across the gold weeds toward the bay. They did not move until she had crossed. Olaf would have laughed, Marit said. Olaf would have nodded, Toby said. They both, after a moment, smiled. That night, in the kitchen of the white clapboard farmhouse on Cherryland Road, Toby and Marit sat at the same scarred pine table where Brock had spread out the folder on a Saturday morning 2 years and 7 months earlier, where the power of attorney and the healthcare directive and the property management agreement had been signed under the kindness of a salesman's slow, careful explanation, and Marit set down 2 cups of tea and a small plate of butter cookies, and Toby took a small leather-bound notebook out of the inner pocket of his navy waxed cotton field jacket, identical in weight and feel to Olaf's apiary records, Sundquist, 1908, and opened it to the first page, and wrote in the slow, careful hand he had learned at his grandmother's elbow in the kitchen of the old cabin in 1952, the date and the line, first swarm housed, hive 17, queen marked white. Below that, on the same line, in the Norwegian he had not in 76 years fully forgotten, he wrote, Velsignet være bagarden, blessed be the bee yards. Marit watched him write. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she set her hand on the back of his hand, the way she had set it on the back of his hand, on the stone wall foundation, on the evening of the auction, and on the night the doctor had said the word stent, and on the cold March morning 45 years ago when their son had not come home. And she said quietly, "There. That's a beginning. It's a continuation," Toby said. "It's both," Marit said. The wood stove crackled. Outside the kitchen window, beyond the lace curtain Marit's grandmother had crocheted in 1937, a thin, first snow had begun to fall on the cherry rows of Cherryland Road, and the bay, 3/4 of a mile to the east through the windbreak, lay under a low pewter sky, and the heavy oak door of the honey house, with its iron strap hinges and its new brass padlock and its small bronze plaque, was closed for the night, and the bees in the restored hives along the eastern slope were clustered tight against the cold, and somewhere on the wall behind the cedar-lined museum room, behind the panel that did not quite match the rest of the boarding, the iron-banded vault door stood unlocked, the small iron key resting on a square of clean cloth on the cedar shelf, waiting, as Olaf had waited, for the next Sundquist who would not sell. Brock did not, in the end, fight. He paid the breach of warranty settlement out of the lake house proceeds and the farmhouse proceeds and a small unsecured loan from a friend in Milwaukee that he was, 3 years later, still repaying. He took a junior position with a commercial real estate firm in Milwaukee, well outside the Door County Peninsula, and he did not, after the first 2 letters on his attorney's letterhead, attempt to contact his grandparents again. Camille's separation became a divorce in the spring of the 2nd year. She moved to Eau Claire permanently and took back her maiden name, Toby and Marit, when Helen, the deputy registrar, quietly mentioned the divorce filing one afternoon at the post office, said only that they were sorry and meant it. "Thank you for walking the cherry rows with Toby and Marit through every patient step of this journey, from the polite cruelty of an assisted living complex to the warm honey light of a vault their great-grandfather had been keeping since 1908. If their story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been managed by a child you raised, if you've ever counted $3 from a coffee can and driven to a courthouse with the only money you still controlled, if you've discovered that the people who came before you had been keeping a vault for the right grandchildren, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realized that the orchard of your childhood remembered who you were, even when your own grandson did not. Because Toby and Marit's story proves that a great-great-grandfather builds a vault only the right grandparents are ever meant to open, that 51 years of marriage holds when 60 acres of cherry orchard come back from a developer's filing cabinet, and that 3 folded singles from a coffee can outweigh $5 million in venture capital when the right couple holds them. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like a worthless honey house on a forgotten Wisconsin peninsula can hold an inheritance no developer ever read, because Olaf Sundquist kept the truth of Door County behind the extracting room for 50 patient years. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.